The morning sun cut through the blinds of the 7th Precinct, casting stripes of light across Detective Greg Nelson's desk. He leaned back in his chair, tossing a stress ball from hand to hand while talking to his partner, Detective Ray Phillips. 4 other detectives huddled nearby, laughing at something on a phone. They all wore the same expression, a look of complete comfort like they owned the place. So I told him, "You can file whatever complaint you want. Who do you think they'll believe, you or this?" Greg tapped the badge on his belt and grinned. Ray chuckled, shaking his head in appreciation of the story. The 7th Precinct wasn't the biggest in the city, but it covered neighborhoods with everything from million-dollar homes to streets where gunshots were as common as car horns. For the past 8 years, Greg and his tight circle had run things their way. They closed cases, that was what mattered to the higher-ups. How they closed them, well, that was their business. Sergeant Tina Walsh approached their desks, coffee in hand. She wasn't part of their inner circle, but she knew how to stay on their good side. "Captain's looking for you," she said to Greg. "What's the old man want now?" Greg sighed, catching the stress ball one last time. "Didn't say. Just asked me to find you." Greg exchanged looks with Ray. Captain Richard Henderson was 3 months from retirement and had given up fighting Greg's group years ago. He mostly stayed in his office, signing whatever was put in front of him and counting down the days until his pension kicked in. "Probably wants help picking out a fishing rod for his retirement," Ray joked. Greg made his way to the captain's office, nodding to officers as he passed. Everyone knew who really ran things around here. The respect wasn't earned through rank, it was taken through results and reputation. He knocked once on the frosted glass door and entered without waiting for a response. Captain Henderson sat behind his desk, looking more tired than usual. "You wanted to see me, Cap?" Henderson gestured to the chair across from him. "Sit down, Nelson." Greg sat, immediately noticing the formal tone. Henderson usually called him by his first name. "I got the call this morning," Henderson said, his voice flat. "They've picked my replacement." Greg nodded slowly. They'd known this was coming, but he'd hoped they might promote from within. Maybe Lieutenant Rivera, who understood how things worked and wouldn't rock the boat. "Who'd they tap?" "Rivera?" Henderson shook his head. "Outside hire. Some hotshot from the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit. Name's Andre Washington." Greg tried to keep his face neutral, but something twisted in his gut. "FBI? What do they know about running a precinct?" Apparently this one knows plenty.
PhD in criminal justice.
Led some task force that cleaned up corruption in 3 major city departments. Has awards for community policing programs. Henderson slid a folder across the desk. His resume reads like a damn textbook on modern policing. Greg flipped open the folder, scanning quickly. The photo showed a black man in his mid-40s with a serious expression and keen eyes that seemed to look right through the camera. Greg closed the folder without reading further. "When does he start?" 2 weeks. I'll be staying on for a month to help with the transition." Greg leaned back, forcing a smile. "Well, let's hope he's ready for the real world. FBI types tend to crack when they hit the streets." Henderson gave him a long look. "I wouldn't underestimate this one, Nelson. Word is he specifically requested this precinct." That caught Greg's attention. "Why would anyone request the 7th? Henderson shrugged. "That's what I'd like to know." Back at his desk, Greg called the others into the break room. Ray, Detectives Cooper, Alvarez, Mercer, and Johnson gathered around the vending machine away from curious ears. "FBI guy," Greg said simply, dropping the folder on the table. "Name's Washington." The others passed the folder around, each taking a moment to look at the photo. "Great," Mercer sighed. "Just what we need. A Fed with something to prove." "And a diversity hire," Cooper added under his breath. Ray flipped through the pages. "Impressive background, though. Harvard, Oxford Fellowship. Citations for bravery. Paper achievements," Greg dismissed. "Doesn't mean he can handle our district." Johnson, the youngest of their group, looked concerned.
Think he'll change things up?
"They all want to at first," Alvarez said. "Remember when Henderson started? Talked big about transparency and accountability. 2 months in, he was drowning in paperwork and letting us handle the real police work." Greg nodded. "Exactly. This Washington guy might have fancy degrees, but we've got something better. We know how things really work around here. The street doesn't care about your PhD when bullets start flying." "So what's the plan?" Cooper asked, crumpling an empty coffee cup. "Business as usual," Greg replied. "We let him come in, make his speeches, hang his diplomas. Meanwhile, we keep doing what we do. He'll either learn to work with us or burn out trying to change what can't be changed. They all nodded, but Greg noticed the uncertainty in their eyes. Something about this felt different from past leadership changes. Look, he added, lowering his voice, we close cases. Our arrest records are the highest in the district. As long as the numbers look good, the brass doesn't care how we get results. Washington will figure that out soon enough. The next 2 weeks passed in a blur of cases and paperwork. Greg made sure his team closed 2 major drug busts and caught a serial burglar who'd been hitting upscale neighborhoods. When the local paper ran a story praising the 7th Precinct's recent successes, Greg made sure copies were left in visible places around the station. The day before Washington's arrival, Greg stopped by Officer Liu Chen's desk. Chen was their computer guy, not officially, but he had ways of getting information that others couldn't. Find anything? Greg asked quietly. Chen glanced around before turning his monitor slightly. Not much beyond what was in his official file. He's kept a pretty low profile for someone with his credentials. Everyone's got something, Greg insisted. Divorce, gambling, drinking problem? Chen shook his head. Married 20 years to the same woman. 2 kids in college. Finances look clean. No complaints in his file, at least none I could access. He hesitated. But I did find one interesting thing. 3 years ago, he led an internal affairs investigation in Boston that ended with 6 officers being fired and 2 facing criminal charges. Greg's jaw tightened. What were the charges? Evidence tampering, excessive force, witness intimidation. Chen looked uncomfortable. Sound familiar? Greg ignored the implied criticism. Keep digging, and check if he has any connections to our district. Henderson said he specifically asked for the 7th. I want to know why. That night, Greg couldn't sleep. He sat on his balcony, nursing a whiskey and staring at the city lights. His condo offered a view of both sides of the district, the wealthy high-rises to the north and the struggling neighborhoods to the south. He'd bought the place 5 years ago paying cash. The real estate agent had been surprised that a detective could afford it. Greg had just smiled and mentioned good investments. His phone buzzed with a text from Ray. Drinks tomorrow after shift to welcome the new boss? Greg typed back, perfect. Let's show him some 7th Precinct hospitality. The next morning, Greg arrived early. He wanted to be at his desk, looking busy and professional when Washington showed up. Others had the same idea. The bullpen was unusually full for 7:30 a.m., with officers who normally rolled in at the last minute already at their desks. At precisely 8 crew, the elevator doors opened. Captain Henderson stepped out, followed by a tall black man in a perfectly tailored Navy suit. Andre Washington moved with quiet confidence, his gaze taking in everything as he walked through the bullpen. Greg noticed how conversations stopped as they passed, how officers straightened in their chairs. Henderson led Washington to the front of the room and cleared his throat. Everyone, I'd like you to meet your new captain, Andre Washington. Washington stepped forward, his voice deeper and more commanding than Greg had expected. Thank you, Captain Henderson. I'm looking forward to working with all of you. I've heard great things about the 7th Precinct's dedication and results. He paused, making eye contact with various officers around the room. When his gaze landed on Greg, it lingered for a moment longer than comfortable. I believe in open communication and teamwork. My door will always be open, but make no mistake. His voice took on a steely edge that made several officers shift in their seats. I also believe in accountability and doing things by the book. Not just because it's the right thing to do, but because it's how we truly serve and protect our communities. Greg maintained eye contact, refusing to look away first. Washington gave him the slightest nod before continuing his speech about goals and expectations. Later, as Washington toured the building with Henderson, Ray sidled up to Greg's desk. So, what do you think? Greg watched Washington through the glass walls of the conference room, noting how he was asking questions and actually listening to the answers, how he was taking notes in a small black notebook. I think, Greg said slowly, that our new captain is either going to be the best thing that ever happened to this place, or he's going to be a problem that needs solving. Ray followed his gaze. And which one are you betting on? Greg didn't answer immediately. There was something about Washington he couldn't quite put his finger on. A sharp intelligence behind those eyes that made him uneasy. Ask me again in a week, he finally said. For now, we stick to the plan. Business as usual. But as he watched Washington shake hands with the administrative staff, treating the civilian employees with the same respect he'd shown the senior officers, Greg couldn't shake the feeling that business at the 7th Precinct was about to be anything but usual. The sun was setting by the time Greg and his crew pushed through the door of O'Malley's bar. The place wasn't fancy, just a neighborhood watering hole with scratched wooden tables and neon beer signs, casting a blue-red glow over everything. But it was their spot, had been for years. The owner, Patrick, was a retired beat cop who gave them a back room whenever they wanted it and never asked questions about their conversations. "First round's on me," Ray announced, heading to the bar where Patrick was already lining up glasses. Detectives Cooper, Alvarez, Mercer, and Johnson slid into their usual corner booth while Greg lingered by the door, checking his phone. "Think he'll show?" Alvarez asked as Greg joined them. Greg shrugged. "We'll see. I gave Henderson the address. Said we wanted to welcome the new captain properly." Ray returned with a tray of whiskeys and beer chasers. "Either way, we get to drink." They clinked glasses and settled in, trading stories about the day's cases and complaining about the mountain of paperwork Captain Washington had requested. He'd spent his first day reviewing case files, arrest records, and complaint histories, the kind of deep dive that made everyone nervous. He asked to see every excessive force complaint from the last 3 years, Cooper said, lowering his voice despite the relative privacy of their booth. Wanted to know how they were resolved, what disciplinary actions were taken. "Standard new boss stuff," Greg replied, trying to sound more confident than he felt. "They all want to show they're taking things seriously at first." Johnson, who'd been quiet so far, leaned forward. "I don't know, Greg. My buddy works in Boston PD, said Washington is the real deal. When he came in to lead their internal affairs, heads rolled." "Boston isn't here," Greg countered. "Different city, different problems. Besides, he's not in IA anymore. He's precinct captain now. His job is to keep the numbers up and the brass happy. That means letting us do our jobs." The bar door swung open and the conversation died instantly. Captain Andre Washington stood in the entrance, still in his suit but without the tie. He scanned the room until his eyes landed on their table. With a slight nod, he made his way to the bar, exchanged a few words with Patrick, and then approached their booth with a glass of what looked like club soda. "Evening. Detectives," he said, his deep voice carrying easily over the bar's ambient noise. "Mind if I join you?" Greg slid over, making room. "Not at all, Captain. That's why we invited you." Washington settled in, his tall frame making the booth seem smaller. Up close, Greg noticed the small scar above his right eyebrow and the watchful intelligence in his eyes. "I appreciate the invitation," Washington said. "Best way to get to know a team is outside the office." An awkward silence fell over the table. These were men used to controlling rooms, to having the upper hand in conversations, but Washington's presence had thrown them off balance. "So," Ray finally spoke up, "FBI to precinct captain seems like an unusual career move. Most people would consider that a step down. If Washington was offended by the implication, he didn't show it. Most people don't understand what makes the job worthwhile. The FBI does important work, but it's often at a distance. I missed being part of a community, seeing the direct impact of good policing." "And what exactly is good policing in your book, Captain?" Cooper asked, a slight edge to his voice. Washington took a sip of his drink before answering. "Fair question. To me, good policing is when the community feels protected by your presence, not threatened by it. When you solve crimes without creating new victims. When you uphold the law by following it yourself." He looked around the table. "But I'm curious about your definition, Detective Cooper." Cooper glanced at Greg, clearly thrown by having the question turned back on him. "Getting bad guys off the streets. Keeping people safe. Doing whatever it takes." "Whatever it takes," Washington repeated thoughtfully. "That's an interesting standard. Would you say that's the general approach at the 7th? The trap was obvious, but Greg stepped in before Cooper could dig them deeper. "What my colleague means is that we're results-oriented. Our clearance rates are the highest in the district. I've seen the numbers." Washington nodded. "They're impressive. I'm just curious about the methods behind them." The table fell silent again. Washington let the silence stretch, seemingly comfortable with the tension. "Look," Greg finally said, "every precinct has its own way of doing things. The 7th has some rough areas. Sometimes standard procedure doesn't cut it. We've developed approaches that work for our district." Washington studied him. "I understand adaptability, Detective Nelson. What concerns me is when approaches cross lines that shouldn't be crossed. With all due respect, Captain, Alvarez cut in, you've been here one day. Maybe give us the benefit of the doubt before assuming we're crossing lines. Fair point, Washington conceded. And I'm not making assumptions. I'm observing. For instance, I observed that the 7th has 3 times the number of excessive force complaints as neighboring precincts, but less than half the number of sustained findings. I observed that certain detectives' names appear repeatedly in those complaints. His gaze settled on Greg. I observed that confidential informant files are incomplete or missing altogether for several major drug busts. The temperature at the table seemed to drop 10 degrees. Washington had done more than flip through files today. Greg forced a smile. Sounds like you've been busy. I believe in being thorough, Washington replied evenly, especially when taking on a new responsibility. Mercer, who had been quiet until now, leaned forward. Can I ask you something straight up, Captain? Why did you request the 7th? There are cushier assignments for someone with your background. For the first time, Washington's composed expression shifted slightly, revealing something harder underneath. Because I go where I'm needed, Detective Mercer. And based on what I've seen so far, the 7th needs me very much. No one knew quite how to respond to that. Washington finished his drink and stood. Gentlemen, thank you for the invitation. I look forward to working with all of you. He placed his card on the table. My personal cell is on the back. Day or night, if you need me or want to talk, call. After he left, the booth remained silent until Ray let out a low whistle. Well, we're screwed. Not necessarily, Greg said, though his mind was racing. He's done his homework, I'll give him that. But knowing there are problems and proving who's responsible are different things. He as good as said he's here to clean house, Johnson pointed out, a nervous edge to his voice. Greg shook his head. He's trying to rattle us. See who breaks ranks first, he looked around the table. Nobody talks to him one-on-one. We stick together. And if he starts digging into specific cases, Cooper asked, then we make sure our paperwork is airtight from now on, Greg replied. And we're careful. Very careful. The next morning, Greg arrived to find Washington already at work, his office light on despite the early hour. Through the glass walls, Greg could see him poring over files, making notes. Several boxes sat on the floor beside his desk, old case files pulled from storage. Judging by the dust and dates, Greg settled at his desk, pretending to focus on reports while watching Washington from the corner of his eye. Around 8, the captain emerged from his office and walked directly to Detective Kelly Howard's desk. Howard wasn't part of Greg's inner circle. She was newer, by the book, and generally kept to herself. Greg couldn't hear their conversation, but he saw Washington show her something in a file, saw her frown and then nod. A moment later, they both headed toward the interview rooms, Howard grabbing her notebook on the way. Ray appeared at Greg's desk, coffee in hand. What's that about? Not sure, Greg murmured. But I don't like it. By lunchtime, rumors were swirling. Washington had spoken privately with 5 different officers, none of them from Greg's crew. He'd also requested ride-along schedules, putting himself in patrol cars for the next 2 weeks to see the district firsthand. Greg was returning from a witness interview when Officer Chen caught him in the hallway. He's looking at the Rivera case, Chen said without preamble, his voice low. Greg felt his stomach tighten. Miguel Rivera had been a mid-level dealer they'd busted last year. The official report said they'd found 2 kilos of cocaine in his apartment during execution of a warrant. What the report didn't mention was that they'd actually found the drugs in his brother's apartment next door, a place not covered by their warrant. How do you know? He had the case file open on his computer when I went in to fix his printer, and he's got Rivera's brother scheduled for an interview tomorrow. Greg nodded slowly. Thanks for the heads up. As he walked away, Greg's mind raced through options. The Rivera case wasn't the only one with corners cut. If Washington started pulling on those threads, things could unravel quickly. Back at his desk, Greg found a note asking him to see the captain at 3. When he entered Washington's office, he was surprised to find the captain alone, standing by the window. Close the door? Please, Washington said without turning around. Greg did so, then took a seat without being asked. Small acts of defiance seemed important now. Washington turned from the window, studying Greg for a long moment before speaking. You've been with the 7th for 12 years. Made detective after 4. Impressive trajectory. I'm good at what I do, Greg replied simply. Yes, your closure rate suggests that. Washington picked up a file from his desk. Tell me about the Wilson arrest last month. Greg kept his expression neutral, though his pulse quickened. The Wilson case had been straightforward on the surface. Drug dealer caught with product and a gun. But they'd used an informant who'd been promised immunity on a separate case, a deal that had never been properly documented. What would you like to know? The source of your initial tip. It's not in the file. Greg had prepared for this. Confidential informant. Street-level dealer we've worked with before. Prefers to stay off paper for obvious reasons. And this informant's information was reliable enough to justify a raid without further corroboration? We did surveillance for 3 days before moving in, Greg countered. It's all in the report. Washington nodded slowly. Yes, the surveillance logs are very detailed. Almost too detailed, one might say. He let that hang in the air between them. Greg said nothing, holding Washington's gaze. Finally, the captain sighed and set the file down. Detective Nelson, I get the feeling you and I are going to be having a lot of conversations like this in the coming weeks. So let me be clear about something. He leaned forward, his voice dropping slightly. I'm not here to be your enemy. I'm here because this precinct has potential it's not reaching. The officers here could be doing real good instead of just making their stats look good. We put criminals behind bars, Greg said stiffly. That is real good. When you do it right, yes, Washington agreed. But when you cut corners, plant evidence, or pressure witnesses, you're undermining the very system you claim to serve. And sooner or later, those cases fall apart in court and the criminals walk free. Greg felt a flush of anger. You've been here 2 days. You don't know what we deal with out there. I know exactly what you deal with, Washington replied, his voice hardening. I worked narcotics in Detroit for 7 years before the FBI. I've been shot twice and stabbed once. I've lost partners. So don't tell me I don't understand the streets. For the first time, Greg felt wrong-footed. He'd assumed Washington was just another bureaucrat with a fancy degree. Then you know sometimes you have to work in the gray areas. Greg tried. Washington shook his head. No, what I know is that the gray areas are where good cops go bad, one small step at a time. He held Greg's gaze. And I think you're smart enough to know that too. Greg stood, suddenly needing to end this conversation. Was there anything else, Captain? Washington studied him for a long moment. Not today. But Detective Nelson, think about where you want to be a year from now. Because I promise you, things at the 7th are going to change. The only question is whether you'll be part of that change or swept away by it. As Greg walked back to his desk, he could feel eyes on him from around the bullpen. Everyone wanted to know what the new captain had said. But for once, Greg didn't have a confident answer to give them. 2 weeks into Captain Washington's tenure at the 7th Precinct, a new routine had settled in. Every morning, Washington arrived before anyone else. Every evening, he was the last to leave. In between, he was everywhere, riding with patrol officers, sitting in on interviews, reviewing body cam footage, and meeting with community leaders from across the district. Greg watched it all with growing unease. Unlike previous captains who barricaded themselves behind paperwork and politics, Washington was actually paying attention. And unlike Greg's initial prediction, the captain showed no signs of burning out or backing down. He's like a machine, Ray complained as they sat in Greg's car, watching a corner store suspected of being a drug front. 3 hours into their surveillance, and they'd seen nothing worth noting. When does he sleep? Greg sipped his cold coffee. He doesn't. Pretty sure he's actually a robot sent from the future to destroy us. Ray laughed, but it sounded forced. Seriously, though, how long can he keep this pace up? Long enough, Greg replied grimly. He's building a case, gathering evidence, moving pieces into position. You make it sound like we're at war. Greg turned to look at his partner. Aren't we? Before Ray could answer, their radio crackled. All available units, shots fired at 1460 Westmore Avenue. Possible officer down. Repeat, officer down. Greg flipped on the siren and peeled away from the curb. Westmore was only a few blocks over. They'd be first on scene. They screeched to a halt outside a rundown apartment building where 2 patrol officers crouched behind their car, guns drawn. One was pressing a wadded-up jacket against the other's leg, blood soaking through the fabric. Greg and Ray ducked low, rushing to the officers. What happened? Greg demanded, pulling his weapon. Serving an eviction notice, the uninjured officer, Peters, explained. Guy opened up through the door. Got Davis in the thigh, might have hit an artery. Davis was pale, sweating. Shooter's still inside. Second floor, apartment 2C. Greg glanced at the building. Any civilians? Unknown. Building should be mostly empty this time of day. More sirens wailed in the distance as Greg made a quick decision. Ray, stay with Davis, apply pressure. I'm going to circle around back in case he tries to run. You should wait for backup, Ray protested. Officer down means we don't wait, Greg replied, already moving. It was the kind of decisive action he was known for, rushing in while others hesitated. He slipped around the side of the building, finding the back entrance unlocked. The stairwell was dark, smelling of urine and stale cooking oil. Greg moved silently, gun raised, listening for any sound from above. Second floor hallway was clear. He edged toward apartment 2C, noting the peeling number on the door, the fresh bullet holes where shots had been fired through at the officers, more sirens outside. Soon the place would be swarming with cops. If the shooter had any sense, he'd be looking to escape now. Greg positioned himself with a clear view of the apartment door, ready to intercept. The door cracked open. A gun barrel poked through. Police! Drop your weapon! Greg shouted. The door flung wide. A man with wild eyes and a handgun burst out, firing wildly as he ran. Greg returned fire, 3 quick shots. The man stumbled, weapon clattering to the floor as he fell. Greg approached cautiously, keeping his gun trained on the fallen suspect. The man wasn't moving. Blood pooled beneath him, spreading across the dirty linoleum. Suspect down, Greg called out, hearing officers now flooding the stairwell. Second floor clear. The next few hours passed in a blur of activity. Paramedics took both the injured officer and the suspect away, though Greg doubted the shooter would survive his wounds. The scene was cordoned off, evidence technicians photographing and collecting shell casings. Greg had just finished giving his preliminary statement when Captain Washington arrived. He surveyed the scene, spoke briefly with the techs, then pulled Greg aside. Walk me through it, he said without preamble. Greg recounted the events, explaining his decision to circle around back while waiting for backup. Washington listened without interrupting, his expression giving nothing away. When Greg finished, the captain glanced around the hallway, taking in the bullet holes, the bloodstain. You went in alone, Washington said finally. Not a question. Officer down, Greg replied, and it paid off. I got the shooter before he could hurt anyone else. Washington studied him. 3 shots? He came out firing. I returned fire to neutralize the threat. I'll need your weapon for ballistics. Greg handed over his gun without hesitation. Standard procedure after a shooting. Preliminary statements from the other officers suggest you acted appropriately, Washington said, but I'll be reviewing all the evidence myself. Something in his tone made Greg pause. Is there a problem, Captain? I hope not, Washington replied. For now, you're on administrative leave pending investigation. Also standard procedure. Greg nodded stiffly. I know the drill. Good. Then you also know to make yourself available for a formal interview tomorrow. Washington turned to leave, then stopped. One more thing, Detective. You said the suspect came out firing? That's right. Interesting. Because we haven't found a single bullet hole from his gun anywhere in this hallway. Only yours. With that, Washington walked away, leaving Greg staring after him. Back at the precinct, news of the shooting had spread quickly. Greg found himself surrounded by supportive colleagues, all telling him he'd done the right thing, that he was a hero for taking down the shooter before anyone else got hurt. Only Ray seemed subdued, watching Greg with an odd expression. What? Greg demanded when they finally had a moment alone in the break room. Ray glanced around to make sure they weren't overheard. Nothing, just, you sure about how it went down? The guy came out shooting? Greg stared at his partner. What are you asking me, Ray? I'm not asking anything. Just making sure we have our stories straight. There's no story. I told it exactly as it happened. Ray held up his hands. Okay. It's just, Washington seems pretty interested in the ballistics. Greg slammed his coffee mug down. Let him be interested. The shooting was clean. That night, Greg couldn't sleep. He kept replaying the moment in his head. The door opening. The gun appearing. His reaction. It had happened so fast. Maybe the suspect hadn't actually fired. Maybe Greg had just thought he saw a muzzle flash in the dim hallway. Did it really matter? The guy was a shooter either way. He'd put an officer in the hospital. He'd been armed and dangerous. Greg had done what any good cop would do, protect himself and others. The next morning, Greg arrived for his formal interview to find Washington and 2 officers from Internal Affairs waiting. His stomach dropped. IA involvement meant this wasn't being treated as a routine shooting review. Detective Nelson, Washington gestured to a chair. "Thank you for coming in. This is Lieutenant Patel and Sergeant Ortiz from Internal Affairs." Greg nodded to the IA officers, trying to look calmer than he felt. "I wasn't aware this was an IA matter. Just covering all bases," Washington replied smoothly. "Given certain inconsistencies in the initial reports." "What inconsistencies?" Greg asked, though he had a sinking feeling he already knew. Lieutenant Patel, a sharp-featured woman with calculating eyes, opened a folder. The suspect, Jerome Willis, was shot 3 times. Twice in the chest, once in the back. Greg felt the room tilt slightly. "That's not possible. He was facing me." "Medical examiner's report says otherwise," Patel continued. "Additionally, ballistics found no evidence that Willis fired his weapon at any point during the confrontation." "He came out of that apartment with a gun," Greg insisted. "It was a high-stress situation. Everything happened in seconds." "We understand that," Washington said, his voice surprisingly gentle. "Combat situations are chaotic. Memory can be unreliable." Something in the captain's tone made Greg wary. This felt too much like being offered an excuse, a way out. "I know what I saw," Greg said firmly. Sergeant Ortiz spoke for the first time. "We've reviewed the body cam footage from the officers who arrived on scene right after the shooting. It shows the suspect's gun was still in his waistband, Detective." "Never drawn." Greg felt cold sweat on his back. "That's not possible." "We also have a witness," Patel added. "A resident in apartment 2D says she heard you identify yourself as police, heard you shout for Willis to drop his weapon, and then immediately heard gunshots. No time in between for Willis to have fired first." "Witnesses get things wrong all the time," Greg argued, "especially about the timing of gunshots." Washington leaned forward. "Greg, I want to be clear about something. Right now, this is an administrative investigation. But depending on what we find, it could become criminal. You have the right to union representation and a lawyer." Greg stared at him in disbelief. "You think I shot an unarmed man?" "I think," Washington said carefully, "that you made a split-second decision in a dangerous situation. I think you believed you were doing the right thing. But I also think you're not telling us the whole truth, and that concerns me greatly." "This is bullshit." Greg stood up. "I've been a cop for 15 years. I've never had a bad shooting." "Please sit down, Detective," Patel said firmly. "No, I'm done here. You want to talk further, contact my union rep." Greg headed for the door. "Nelson," Washington called after him. "Running away only makes this worse." Greg paused at the door. "I'm not running. I'm just not going to sit here while you try to railroad me for doing my job." As he stormed out, Greg caught sight of Ray waiting in the hallway, looking uncomfortable. He must have been called in to give his statement next. "They're making it sound like I executed the guy," Greg hissed. Ray wouldn't meet his eyes. "Greg, man, just tell them the truth. Whatever happened, it'll be better coming from you." Greg stared at his partner in shock. "You too? You think I'm lying?" "I think you're under a lot of pressure. We all are, with Washington watching our every move. Maybe things didn't happen exactly like you said." "Unbelievable." Greg shook his head. 15 years of partnership and you turn on me the first chance you get." "It's not like that," Ray protested. "I'm trying to help you. Help me?" "By what, suggesting I shot a man in the back? Some friend you are." Greg pushed past him, heading for the exit. As he drove home, Greg's mind raced. It was all falling apart. The shooting. The investigation. Even Ray was distancing himself. And behind it all was Washington, methodically taking apart everything Greg had built. For the first time in his career, Detective Greg Nelson felt something he'd never expected to feel while wearing the badge. Fear. 3 days into his administrative leave, Greg's apartment felt like a prison. Empty pizza boxes and takeout containers littered the coffee table. The blinds stayed closed, keeping out the morning sun. His phone, switched to silent, blinked with unanswered messages. Mostly from Ray, a few from other colleagues, none of which he wanted to read. The bottle of whiskey on the counter was half empty now. Not enough to make him drunk, just enough to take the edge off the thoughts circling endlessly in his head. The knock on his door came just after noon. Greg ignored it at first, but whoever was outside was persistent. "Nelson, I know you're in there." "Open up," Washington's voice. Greg considered pretending he wasn't home, but what was the point? The captain would just come back. He opened the door without a greeting, turning his back immediately to walk into the living room. Let Washington see the mess. Let him see what this witch hunt was doing to him. "Nice place," Washington commented, following him inside. He surveyed the apartment. The high ceilings, the expensive furniture, the view of the city through the slits in the blinds. "Must have cost you. What do you want?" Greg demanded, dropping onto the couch. Washington remained standing, hands in the pockets of his trench coat. "The investigation is ongoing. Ballistics confirmed your gun was the only one fired at the scene. The medical examiner's report shows the shot to Willis's back was the kill shot, fired as he was turning away from you." Greg stared at the floor. "So you came to gloat? Tell me I'm finished?" "No," Washington said quietly. "I came to understand." That made Greg look up. "Understand what?" "Why a detective with your experience would shoot a man in the back. Why you'd lie about it. What happened in that hallway, Greg?" Something in Washington's tone, the lack of accusation, the genuine question, caught Greg off guard. For a brief moment he considered telling the truth, that he'd seen the gun, had shouted a warning, and fired when Willis turned as if to run back into the apartment, that he'd been afraid the suspect might have hostages inside or another weapon, that the decision had been made in a split second of fear and adrenaline. But admitting that would mean admitting he'd lied in his official statement, that he'd shot a man who wasn't an immediate threat, that after years of bending rules and cutting corners he'd finally crossed a line he couldn't uncross. "I told you what happened," Greg said flatly. "If the evidence doesn't match, then something's wrong with your evidence." Washington sighed, disappointment clear on his face. "That's your final answer?" "Yeah, that's my final answer." "Then I have no choice but to recommend termination and possible criminal charges." Washington pulled a folded paper from his pocket and set it on the coffee table. "This is the formal notice. There will be a hearing next week. I suggest you get a lawyer." Greg stared at the paper but didn't touch it. "You've been gunning for me since day one. You came to the 7th looking for someone to take down, and I was your target. Is that what you think?" Washington shook his head. "I came to the 7th because the precinct had potential, because most of the officers there are good cops who've been led down the wrong path by a few bad influences. I wanted to clean house, yes, but I was hoping you'd be part of the solution, not the problem." "Right," Greg scoffed. "You had my file before you ever set foot in the precinct. You knew exactly who I was. I knew you were smart, respected, a natural leader." Washington's gaze was steady. "I thought you might be salvageable." The word stung more than Greg expected. "Get out." Washington turned to leave, then paused at the door. "One more thing. Ray Phillips came to me yesterday. Voluntarily, he's prepared to testify about a number of irregularities in cases you've worked together. Planted evidence. Coerced confessions. Missing drug seizures." Greg felt the floor drop out from under him. "You're lying. He's being offered immunity in exchange for his cooperation." Washington held Greg's gaze. "The dam is breaking, Nelson. Phillips is just the first. By this time next week, your whole house of cards will come down." After Washington left, Greg sat motionless for nearly an hour. Ray had flipped. After 15 years as partners, as friends, he'd turned. And if Ray was talking, how long before the others followed? Cooper, Alvarez, Mercer, Johnson, they'd save themselves if they could. Everything Greg had built was crumbling around him. His career, his reputation, his freedom, all because of Washington. The thought crystallized into a burning rage. This was Washington's fault. He'd come into their precinct, their world, and deliberately destroyed it. He'd turned Ray against him. He'd dug up the shooting, twisted the evidence to make Greg look guilty. Greg stood abruptly, sudden clarity cutting through the fog of alcohol and self-pity. He wasn't going down without a fight. Washington had started this war, but Greg would finish it. He showered, shaved, and dressed carefully. Sobriety returned with purpose. In his bedroom closet behind the false panel where he kept his personal gun safe, Greg retrieved a small notebook. In it were names, dates, and details, insurance he'd been collecting for years. Dirt on judges, prosecutors, even a deputy commissioner. People who'd looked the other way, accepted favors, bent rules when it suited them. If Washington wanted to play hardball, Greg had a few pitches of his own. He drove downtown to a diner where the owner, a former informant who owed Greg his life, let him use the back office phone. Can't trace calls from there, no cameras, no records. First call, Judge Thomas Lancaster. The judge who'd signed off on dozens of Greg's warrants without asking too many questions, who'd spent a weekend in Atlantic City on Greg's dime after a particularly helpful ruling. "It's Nelson," Greg said when the judge answered. "We need to talk about Captain Andre Washington." "I can't be having this conversation," Lancaster replied, voice hushed. "Make time. He's coming after me, and if I go down, I'm not going alone. Remember Atlantic City?" "Silence, then. What do you want?" "Pressure. From above. Get the commissioner to rein him in. The commissioner doesn't control IA investigations. Find a way, or your wife finds out about the cocktail waitress." Greg hung up before the judge could respond. Next call. Assistant District Attorney Veronica Winters. She'd buried evidence on 2 of Greg's cases. Evidence that might have exonerated the defendants. "Nelson, are you insane? I heard you're under investigation." Her voice was tense, frightened. "That's why I'm calling. I need your help with Washington. I can't interfere with an IA case. My hands are tied." "Really? Were your hands tied when you lost the witness statements in the Torres case? The ones that contradicted my testimony?" Winter's voice dropped to a whisper. "That was years ago. I was new. You said he was guilty anyway." "He probably was. But that's not how the system works, is it, counselor?" Greg let the threat hang in the air. "What do you want me to do? Find a problem with the shooting investigation. Procedural issues. Witness credibility. Something to make the case go away. I'll see what I can do." 3 more calls. 3 more pressure points. By the time Greg left the diner, he'd activated every lever of influence he had. If even one paid off, Washington's investigation would hit roadblocks. Best case, it would be shut down entirely. Greg felt better than he had in days. He was fighting back, taking control. The feeling lasted until he turned the corner to his apartment building and saw the unmarked police car waiting out front. 2 detectives he recognized from internal affairs stood by the entrance. His phone rang. "Unknown number, Nelson," he answered. "It's Washington. We need to talk. I think your IA friends are already here for that. They're not there for a talk. They're there to arrest you." Washington's voice was grim. "Bank records, Nelson. Should have been more careful." Greg's blood ran cold. "What are you talking about?" "Large cash deposits. Property you shouldn't be able to afford on a detective's salary. Offshore accounts linked to dealers you supposedly put away. Did you really think I wouldn't look?" Greg leaned against a wall, suddenly dizzy. The financial trail. He'd always been so careful with that. Or thought he had been. "You can run," Washington continued, "but it won't help. We have enough to put you away for 20 years. Minimum." Greg watched the IA detective scanning the street looking for him. "Why are you calling to warn me?" A pause. "Because despite everything, I still believe people deserve a chance to do the right thing. Turn yourself in. Cooperate. Give up the others who were involved. The higher-ups who protected you. Help me clean up the 7th. Greg laughed bitterly. "So that's what this call really is. Another attempt to flip me like you flipped Ray. Ray Phillips came to me, Nelson. He was tired of living with what you'd both done. Tired of the lies, the corruption. He wanted out." "He wanted a deal," Greg spat. "Yes," Washington admitted. "But he also wanted to make things right. You still can, too." Greg watched as a 3rd IA detective joined the others, pointing toward the back of the building, covering the exits. They were closing in. "How long have you been investigating me?" "Really?" Washington sighed. 6 months before I requested the transfer. We had reports of corruption in the 7th, but we needed someone on the inside to gather evidence. So this whole captain transfer thing was a setup from the beginning. The transfer was real. But yes, you were the target." Greg felt a strange sense of calm settle over him. 6 months of investigation. Bank records. Ray's testimony. It was over. "Nelson, are you still there?" Greg watched the IA detectives enter his building. "Yeah, I'm here. What's it going to be? Run, fight, or do the right thing for once?" Greg closed his eyes, seeing clearly for the first time in years. All the lies, the shortcuts, the justifications. The badge that he thought made him untouchable. "I'll call you back," he said finally. "Don't wait too long," Washington replied. "This is your last chance." Greg ended the call and stood very still, weighing his options. Run and live as a fugitive, fight and almost certainly lose, or surrender and cooperate, betray his friends like Ray had betrayed him. None of the choices felt right. None of them felt like something Detective Greg Nelson would do. But maybe that was the point. Maybe Detective Greg Nelson wasn't who he should be anymore. 18 months later, Greg Nelson sat in an unfamiliar suit at an unfamiliar desk. The community center bustled with activity, teenagers playing basketball in the gym, younger kids getting help with homework in the classroom next door. Through the window of his small office, he could see the same streets he used to patrol, but now he saw them differently. The knock on his door frame pulled him from his thoughts. Captain Andre Washington stood there, no longer in his usual suit but in casual clothes, jeans and a sweater that made him look more like a college professor than a police captain. "Mind if I come in?" Washington asked. Greg gestured to the chair across from him. "It's your community center, or at least your idea." Washington sat, glancing around the modest office with its motivational posters and stacks of program applications. "How's the youth outreach program going?" "Better than expected," Greg admitted. "We've got 35 kids now, most of them from the neighborhoods I used to arrest people in." "That's good to hear." Washington nodded. "The commissioner is impressed with the numbers. Juvenile arrests down 18% in the district since the program started." Greg shrugged. "These kids just needed someone to give them a chance. Show them there are options besides the streets." He paused. "Not that I'm taking credit. This was your vision. But you're making it work," Washington countered. "That counts for something." A silence fell between them, not entirely comfortable, but not as tense as it once would have been. So much had changed since that day when Greg had stood on the street, watching IA detectives closing in, contemplating whether to run or fight. In the end, he'd done neither. Instead, he'd walked into his building through the side entrance, taken the elevator up to his apartment, and waited. When the IA detectives knocked, he'd opened the door without resistance. What followed were the hardest months of his life. The arrest. The perp walk in front of cameras. Former colleagues watching as he was led away in handcuffs. The headlines, "Dirty Cop Ring Exposed. Precinct Corruption Scandal Widens." The plea deal had been Washington's doing. In exchange for full cooperation, names, dates, details on every case where corners had been cut, every instance of planted evidence or pocketed cash, Greg received a reduced sentence, 5 years, suspended, probation, community service, and a permanent end to his law enforcement career. He'd expected to hate Washington for it, to resent being the one who took the fall while others fled or made their own deals. Instead, he'd found something unexpected in the wreckage of his former life. Relief. "I saw Ray last week," Washington said, breaking the silence. "He's doing well in Seattle." "New department, new start." Greg nodded stiffly. Ray had received a similar deal. Immunity in exchange for testimony, forced retirement, no jail time. Last Greg had heard, his former partner had moved across the country to escape the scandal's shadow. Cooper and Alvarez weren't so lucky. Washington continued. "Trial starts next month." Unlike Greg and Ray, Detectives Cooper and Alvarez had refused to cooperate, had fought the charges, claimed they were being framed. The evidence against them, much of it provided by Greg's testimony, was overwhelming. They made their choice, Greg said quietly. It still felt strange, testifying against men who had once been like brothers to him. But the brotherhood had been built on lies, on a corrupt foundation that had finally crumbled. Washington studied him. "Any regrets?" Greg considered the question. "About cooperating?" "No, about the 15 years before that. Too many to count. That's why I'm here, actually." Washington leaned forward. "The department is implementing a new training program. Ethics, community relations, proper procedures. The commissioner thinks it would be valuable to have someone who's been on both sides." Greg stared at him. "You want me to teach cops? After everything that happened?" "Who better? You know where the lines are because you crossed them. You understand the slippery slope because you slid down it. The officers would never accept it." "I'm the last person they'd want to learn from." Washington shook his head. "You'd be surprised. Your testimony didn't just bring down corrupt cops. It exposed the system that enabled them. The judges who looked the other way. The prosecutors who buried evidence. The supervisors who encouraged result over process." He paused. "You helped clean up more than just the 7th precinct, Greg." Greg turned to look out the window again, watching two boys shoot hoops in the community center's small outdoor court. One of them, Darnell, had been on his way to juvenile detention before the outreach program intervened. Now he was on track to graduate, talking about community college. "I'll think about it," Greg said finally. Washington nodded and stood to leave. At the door, he turned back. "For what it's worth, I meant what I said that day in your office. I always thought you were salvageable." After Washington left, Greg sat for a long time, turning over the unexpected offer in his mind. Teaching police cadets about ethics seemed like bitter irony after everything he'd done. Yet who better understood the cost of crossing those lines? His phone buzzed with a text from Darnell. "Still on for SAT prep tonight?" Greg smiled slightly, texting back, 6 p.m., don't be late. This wasn't the life he'd imagined for himself. The money was nothing compared to what he'd made as a detective, especially with the side income that had eventually exposed him. The apartment was smaller, the car older. The respect he once commanded through fear was gone. But there was something else in its place. Something he hadn't felt in years, maybe never truly felt. Purpose. Real purpose. Not the twisted justifications he'd used to rationalize corruption. Later that evening, after the SAT prep session, Greg locked up the community center. Darnell and two other boys waited for him outside. "Mr. Nelson," Darnell said, "my mom wanted me to invite you to dinner Sunday. She's making her famous fried chicken." Greg smiled. "Tell her I'd be honored." As the boys headed home, Greg walked to his car, parked beneath a streetlight in the same neighborhood where he'd once conducted raids and made arrests. A patrol car cruised slowly past. The young officer inside, one Greg didn't recognize from his time at the 7th, nodded respectfully. Greg returned the nod, feeling the strange disconnect of his new reality. He was no longer the law here, no longer the power to be feared. Yet somehow he had more positive impact now than he ever had with a badge and gun. His phone rang. "Washington again. Forgot to mention something," the captain said when Greg answered. "The commissioner's planning a press conference about the new training initiative. He'd like you there if you decide to take the position." Greg leaned against his car. "Public appearance? That's asking a lot." "It is," Washington agreed. "But your story, both the fall and the redemption, matters. It could change how departments across the country approach these issues. I'm no poster boy for police reform. Not a poster boy." A cautionary tale and a success story rolled into one. Washington paused. "Think about the kids in your program, Greg. Think about what it would mean for them to see this full circle." After they hung up, Greg drove home through familiar streets that now held new meaning. He passed the corner where he'd first crossed the line, pocketing cash during a drug bust 15 years ago. Past the apartment building where the shooting had happened, where everything had begun to unravel. At a red light, he stopped beside another patrol car. Two officers sat inside, a middle-aged white man and a young black woman. The future of the department post-cleanup. They glanced at him, then did a double take, clearly recognizing him from the news coverage. Greg expected to see contempt in their eyes. Instead, he saw something that looked almost like respect. The male officer nodded slightly before the light changed and they drove away. Back at his apartment, modest but clean, a far cry from the luxury condo corruption had bought him, Greg made a decision. He'd take Washington's offer. Not for redemption or forgiveness, but because it was the right thing to do. Because someone needed to tell new officers what he'd learned the hard way. That a badge wasn't a shield from consequences, but a responsibility to be better. He poured himself a glass of water instead of the whiskey he might have chosen in his old life, and sat down to plan a curriculum. What would he tell them, these fresh-faced cadets? How would he explain his journey from decorated detective to corrupt cop to whatever he was now? He began to write, "I thought my badge made me invincible. I was wrong. Power doesn't corrupt people. People corrupt power. And the moment you think the rules don't apply to you is the moment you've lost your way." The words came easily now. The truth, after so many years of lies, felt like a language he was finally becoming fluent in. Outside his window, the city continued its nighttime rhythm. Somewhere out there, Washington was still working, still building a better department piece by piece. Former colleagues were adapting to the new reality, or facing consequences for refusing to change. And kids like Darnell were seeing a different future because one corrupt cop had finally found his moral compass. Greg Nelson had lost his badge, his status, his ill-gotten gains. But sitting there in his simple apartment, writing words that might help prevent others from making his mistakes, he realized he'd gained something far more valuable, a second chance to serve and protect, the right way this time.